Okay, so we've finally come to the point where we're going to start creating our own resources inside of our Rails application. And what I mean by resources is a thing that users can create in your application, whether it's a tweet or a post or a pin or a comment or whatever. We call these things resources in Rails, and what a resource means and why we call it that should start to become more obvious over the course of the next 2 weeks. Now, we've already created resources in our applications, technically, when we created users. But in those cases, it was all these gems we were using that were doing it for us. So we may not really have understood what was happening behind the scenes. But it's time to now dive deeper into Rails and actually get a sense of what's happening, how controllers, models, and views are working, and what you actually put inside of each. Now, it'll be probably a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot that you're going to learn over the next few days and next 2 weeks. So stick with me, and let's get through this together. The first thing that you guys should know about as a resource is the Rails guides, which actually are at guides.rubyonrails.org, have a lot that you can use to explore basically all different parts of Rails and digging deeper. And I highly recommend that if you're ever curious about working with JavaScript in Rails, or the asset pipeline, or models, or command line tools, all of this stuff. And in particular, what I have open here is the Rails command line. And you can even check the basic ones that we've done so far, like Rails server, Rails new. These are all the commands in the command line that start with Rails. And in Rails generate, you can see how Rails generate typically works. So you can generate a controller, like we did. They show you running bin/Rails, but you can just do Rails for short. We've done a controller. This time around, we're going to generate something called a scaffold. So you can check out this section about setting up a scaffold. Here it says a scaffold in Rails is a full set of models, database migrations for the model, a controller to manipulate it, and views to view and manipulate the data, and a test suite. We won't be using the test suite, but it'll still create that automatically for us. And it gives an example of setting up a resource, there's that word again, called HighScore to keep track of the highest scores on video games we play. So they run the command Rails generate scaffold HighScore, and then game:string score:integer. We're not going to be doing HighScore, but we will be creating our own resource using a very similar formula that they have here. So we'll follow along with me in the meanwhile. Make sure you're in the right place inside of that main folder. And we're going to create a scaffold. So first, I'll show you how you would do this with a tweet resource, which is basically, like we're building Twitter. I would run Rails generate scaffold, and I'm going to use the same formatting that I have here. This is singular, so not high scores, but HighScore, and it's capital letters at the beginning. So I'll just call it a tweet. The pluralization matters and capitalization matters. That's just something to get used to when you're coding, to just try to make sure it's exactly right. Otherwise, you may end up with slight differences, and things will break without you realizing it. And now, after creating this, you can basically pass through a list of things that your resource has. Think of this as properties of a resource. So what is it on a tweet? If you have a tweet, what kind of things does it have? If this is like, as our user, we had a user has an email, a user has a password. Imagine humans have properties. So humans have a height, have a gender, have a weight, have all of these things. What does a tweet have? This is one of those areas where you really sometimes have to sit and think a little bit about what resources you need to have inside of your application to create what you're trying to create. And it may not be super obvious at first. Sometimes it's even something you have to think about with other people. We can get more into that in a little bit as we start to create more resources that interact with each other. But I'll tell you in this case, what we want is it has a user. So every tweet has a user associated with it. And the way that you do this in Rails is it's user::references. This is actually new in Rails, and this allows you to basically say, what this will actually do is it'll set a user ID on the tweet, and that user ID will match the user's ID. So ID, every object in Rails and in your database will have an ID column that gets created automatically. Usually starts at 1 and then just goes up by 1 every time. You cannot have two things with the same ID in your database. And when you say that this user has these tweets or vice versa, it's usually the ID that we use to identify them. So it's not the user, we don't identify them by email or by name, but by their ID. And the reason for that is it's the only thing we can really guarantee is unique to that user or to that tweet. There may be other people with the same email or name or something like that, but IDs are very safe and that they're meant for this purpose. So a tweet has a user, and let's also say it has content. Like this is the actual text of the tweet, and you put a colon there and text. So this should be enough. I'm going to add another option here with the space -- skip - style sheets. Because by default, a Rails generator actually generates a Scaffold style sheet, which it shows you here, and we don't want that. We already have our styles and stuff set up, so we're fine with this. It's okay if you don't do this; you can just delete that, but this should be good for now. So copy along with this, even if you're not building, the Twitter kind of application. We're going to now go through and unpack it even further.